Hello everyone, and welcome to my General Hospital official channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up.
Jocelyn Jacks had always believed that her life was complicated enough, but she was always surprised by the unexpected revelations that came from Port Charles. In order to distract herself from her own complicated relationships and the significant losses she had suffered over the years, she had been volunteering at General Hospital. She met Vaughn for the first time at that time. He was more than simply another patient or guest. He had a subdued intensity that made her think of someone she knew but couldn't quite identify. Without even trying, Vaughn's aura, guarded demeanor, and piercing blue eyes attracted attention. Joss had a nagging suspicion from their first encounter that there was more to him, that he was connected to her world in ways she didn't fully comprehend. She dismissed it as mere curiosity until a series of tiny hints started to come together, each one pointing her in the direction of a revelation that would rock Port Charles to its foundations. When Vaughn brought up his adopted parents in a casual chat, that was the first hint. He acknowledged that although they had been kind and caring, he had always had the uneasy suspicion that something about his background was being withheld from him. Compassionate and curious as usual, Joss urged him to learn more. She was familiar with what it was like to have doubts about identity, family, and the truth. At first, Vaughn shrugged it off, but as he talked more, his defenses lowered. He acknowledged that he had attempted to look for records, but all of his searches had ended in failure. He felt uneasy because of the locked documents, holes in his past, and unsolved questions. Joss's intuition grew as she listened. There was a tale here that related to her world in ways she had not yet comprehended, so Vaughn wasn't just any young man searching for answers. She was reminded of Jason Morgan, whom she had trusted with her life on multiple occasions, by the way he looked, held himself, and even hesitated when trust was involved. The next piece of the puzzle didn't fit together until weeks later. At Charlie's pub, Vaughn had gotten into a fight while standing up for a stranger who had been tormented by some troublemakers. Joss was present that evening and witnessed firsthand how Vaughn fought, calm, effective, and without wasted motions, much like Jason. She had witnessed Jason use that same quiet precision to defeat larger, more powerful opponents, and it made her shudder. Vaughn became aloof and murmured something about instinct when she questioned him about where he had learned to fight like way. Joss was highly affected by the word. She was unable to let it go. Whether he was on a motorcycle, engaged in combat, or defending those he cared about, Jason lived by instinct. She had a gut feeling that this was no accident. Vaughn was more than simply a stranger. Nobody had recognized the connection between him and Jason. Joss was initially concerned that she was overanalyzing things, so she kept her suspicions to herself, but the more she observed Vaughn, the more difficult it got to ignore. When they met, she saw how his eyes stayed on Sam McCall, as though he recognized her without understanding why. Even though Sonny Corinthos hardly gave him a second look, she saw that he seemed strangely at ease around him. Most importantly, she observed that when Vaughn and Jason eventually met in a brief, stressful meeting at the hospital, they seemed to naturally gravitate toward one another. Something familiar, something uneasy had flickered in Jason's face as he had brushed by him. Even though no one else noticed, Joss did. She had started to suspect that Vaughn wasn't just a random stranger who happened to come up in Port Charles, and that moment confirmed it. No one has yet to recognize that he was Jason's son. Her mind started racing at the revelation. Joss was unable to eat or sleep without mentally going over every hint. In silence, she started looking through everything she could find, including old adoption files and medical records. By proxy, she had acquired Sonny's stubbornness and Carly's tenacity, and she wasn't going to let this go until she got answers. Shortly after, she discovered a medical file that left her speechless. There was no denying that Vaughn's blood type and genetic markers were identical to Jason's. Joss's hands were shaking as she sat still in front of the screen. She was aware that this was not another twist in a soap drama. This had a profound impact on my life. Vaughn had a father whose whole life was based on devotion, selflessness, and love for the family he chose, and Jason had a son he was unaware of. What frightened her the most, though, was that the revelation wasn't hers to own. Joss struggled with the secret's weight. Does she have to tell Jason? Does she have to tell Vaughn? Or should she wait till she was certain before telling anyone? After everything Jason had been through, she didn't want to cause him any pain. She was aware, however, that Vaughn was entitled to the truth. Jason stayed in the dark about a kid who was wandering around Port Charles without even knowing his father's face. Vaughn lived in uncertainty about who he was, and she remained silent every day. She was plagued by a moral quandary and knew that the secret would eventually come to light because secrets in Port Charles were never kept hidden for very long. The citizens of Port Charles went about their daily lives, oblivious to the seismic change that was about to upend one of their most prominent families, as the sun set low over the city, bathing the busy streets in a golden light. Sitting in the Metro Court's corner booth, Jocelyn Jax's blonde hair caught the last of the light as she nervously traced the rim of her coffee cup. Her mother, Carly Corinthos, leaned forward across from her, her worried eyes piercing hers. Unspoken tension, the kind that had been building for weeks, was heavy in the air between them. Carly knew her daughter well enough to see that a storm was building, and Jocelyn had been acting oddly, distant, distracted. "What's going on, Josh?" Carly inquired in a stern but concerned tone. "For days, you have been avoiding me. You can let me know what it is." When Jocelyn's blue eyes met her mother's, they were obscured by something Carly couldn't quite identify, perhaps dread or remorse. Her eyes returned to the table as she closed her mouth after opening it to speak. She could not just blurt out what she had discovered since it was too explosive and hefty. However, she was unable to contain it any longer. After what she'd witnessed, no. Not in light of what she had heard. "It's about Jason, Mom," Jocelyn said, her voice almost audible above a whisper. Carly's maternal instincts kicked in, causing her posture to straighten. One constant in their turbulent environment was Jason Morgan, her best friend, her rock, and the man who had been through everything with her. Carly was aware that whatever Jocelyn was going to say would not go well. "How about Jason?" Carly pressed, her voice now more acerbic. Jocelyn steadied herself by taking a big breath. "I discovered something. Something significant. And I'm not sure how to deal with it." Carly narrowed her eyes and leaned closer. "Joss, spit it out. What did you discover?" After a moment of hesitation, Jocelyn took a folded piece of paper out of her backpack. Her hands shaking a little, she handed it across the table to her mother. Carly scanned the document and unfolded it, her brow furrowed. It was a medical file from a clinic outside of Port Charles that was dated back many years. Carly's heart skipped a beat when she saw the specifics, even though the name at the top wasn't Jason's. Jocelyn's voice broke the quiet as she said, "Vaughn. It concerns Vaughn." Carly's gaze jerked upward, meeting her daughter's. From the beginning, Vaughn, the mysterious young guy who had just moved to Port Charles a few months prior, had been a mystery. He reminded Carly of someone she couldn't quite name since he was sharp, personable, and had a calm intensity. Working odd jobs at the docks and developing a guarded friendship with Jocelyn, he had easily assimilated into their culture. However, he always had a distinctive quality about himself. "How about Vaughn?" Carly asked in a quiet voice, as if she were afraid of the response. Jocelyn took a deep breath. "He is the son of Jason." Carly could feel the words echoing in her head like a thunderclap. Her mouth parted slightly as she gazed at Jocelyn, but she remained silent. Jason's son? There was no way. Jason Morgan couldn't have a son that no one knew about because he had lived his entire life under scrutiny, with both friends and foes watching every action he took. Could he? Joss, that's not possible, Carly shook her head. Jason would have informed me. He wouldn't withhold such information from me. Would he not? Jocelyn shot back, her voice growing louder. Mom, consider it. Jason has dedicated his life to defending those he cares about. Don't you think he would keep it a secret if he had a child out there, someone he didn't want pulled into this mess, into the danger of his world? From you, too? Carly's thoughts were racing, recalling Jason's background. The losses, the adversaries, the perilous years. She considered Elizabeth, Sam, and Jason's already existing kids, Jake and Danny. Is there another? Someone he had concealed to protect? Where did this come from? Carly held up the medical record and demanded. Evidently reluctant to divulge her source, Jocelyn chewed her lip. At the hospital, I was assisting Dr. Finn by looking over some old files. I discovered this in a box of unclaimed records, even though I wasn't supposed to. Mom, it was misfiled. It's true. Jason's DNA is identical to Vaughn's. It was tested for me. Carly's gaze expanded. Did you get it tested? Do you realize how risky it is, Jocelyn? If somebody else discovers... I understand. Jocelyn cut in, raising her voice. I had to be certain, even though I knew it was dangerous. I couldn't ignore it. Mom, Vaughn isn't even aware. He doesn't know who his dad is. Carly reclined in her chair as the realization weighed her down like a dense mist. She imagined Jason out there, most likely on some perilous errand for Sunny, unaware that his history had just unexpectedly come back to haunt him. And Vaughn, poor Vaughn, who had been living in Port Charles in the shadow of everyone's eyes without realizing the influence he had. With a firmer tone now, Jocelyn stated, "We have to tell him. Jason is entitled to know. Additionally, Vaughn ought to be aware of his identity." Carly shook her head, the implications already causing her thoughts to race. Joss, it's not that easy. This might endanger Vaughn if it leaks. Jason has a lot of adversaries, as you are aware. Additionally, she thought of her ex-husband, whose empire was based on control and loyalty, as she trailed off, and Sunny. Jason's secret son might cause complications that none of them had anticipated. Jocelyn, however, was not about to back down. I understand, Mom. It's disorganized. It's risky. However, it is unfair to everyone if this is kept a secret. Vaughn has spent his entire life by himself, moving from place to place without ever knowing his origins. Additionally, Jason has already lost a great deal. He would like to know that he had another son, wouldn't he? The thought made Carly's heart hurt. Jason had always been a guardian, a guy who silently carried the consequences of his decisions. Carly was certain that Jason would stop at nothing to protect Vaughn if he was really his son. However, she was also aware of the price of disclosing such a secret. Carly finally responded, "Let me talk to Jason first," her voice steady despite her inward distress. Joss, we must exercise caution in this matter. Without a plan, we can't just throw something at him or Vaughn. Despite her hesitant demeanor, Jocelyn nodded. All right. However, swear to me that you won't wait for too long. We cannot ignore this issue indefinitely. Carly squeezed her daughter's hand as she reached across the table. I swear. But this is how we do it. For the benefit of everybody. Jason Morgan was huddled behind a pile of crates in a dark building close to the docks, across town, his senses keen and his rifle pulled. There was the slight buzz of equipment in the distance, and the air was heavy with the smell of salt water and oil. For Sunny, he had been following up on a cargo that had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Before it wasn't, the task was routine. He was brought back to reality by the sound of approaching footsteps. A quiet, wary voice called out, "Jason." His tech-savvy ally, Spinelli, had been providing him with intelligence from a safe distance. You're not alone. 2 armed men are approaching from the east entrance. Jason adjusted his hold on the revolver and gave himself a nod. Despite his concentration, a tiny part of him was unable to get rid of the uneasiness that had been bothering him for days. There was something wrong, but he couldn't identify it. It wasn't the job, there was risk involved. Something else, something intimate, was involved. Jason's thoughts briefly strayed to Jocelyn as the footsteps approached. The previous time they had spoken, she had been acting strangely, her normal friendliness having been replaced by an unexplained nervousness. He forced himself to concentrate, pushing the thought away. He would take care of whatever was wrong with Jocelyn later. He had a job to complete right now. In the meantime, Vaughn sat by himself in his tiny apartment above Kelly's diner, gazing at a faded picture that he had kept for years. The faint picture of a woman with gentle eyes cradling a kid he recognized as his was the only connection he had to his history. He had no idea who she was, where she lived, or even whether she was still alive. He only had bits and pieces of a life that he was unable to put together. He had visited Port Charles on a whim, attracted by an enigmatic feeling of familiarity. He couldn't explain why, but the town seemed like home in a way that no other place ever had. He had generally stayed to himself, taking odd jobs and avoiding attention. However, everything had changed after meeting Jocelyn. She was forceful, caring, and not hesitant to confront him when he was acting too defensively. Vaughn felt as though he might fit in for the first time in years. However, the picture he was holding revealed something else. It served as a reminder that he wasn't really sure who he was. He also believed that the answers were just out of grasp the longer he stayed in Port Charles. Carly's mind was already racing with what was about to happen when she slipped the medical document into her purse back at the Metro Court. She had to locate Jason and find a way to impart the news to him without upsetting the delicate equilibrium of their universe. But just as she got up to go, Sunny texted her on her phone. "There is trouble in the warehouse. Jason is deeply involved. I need you right now." Carly's heart fell. She would have to wait to speak whatever she had meant to say to Jason. He needed her now, in a different way. She turned to look at Jocelyn, who was observing her with a mixture of fear and hope. "Remain here," Carly replied firmly. "And don't discuss this with anyone." "Not quite yet." Jocelyn nodded, but Carly couldn't get rid of the feeling that everything was going to change as she rushed out of the Metro Court. Regardless of how cautiously they handled it, the explosion was inevitable because the secret she had discovered was a ticking time bomb. The warehouse was the ideal location for an ambush because it was a labyrinth of steel and shadows. With his years of experience leading him through the darkness, Jason walked in silence. As the two armed guys drew closer, Spinelli's voice crackled in his earpiece, providing him with information. Jason wasn't going to let them get the better of him even though he had no idea who they were working for, a rival mob, a renegade agent, or something else entirely. As the men walked by, their voices low and frantic, he crept around a corner and pressed himself against a wall. They believed Jason had what they were searching for. He was unsure of its nature, but he would be damned if he allowed them to discover it. His mind kept returning to Jocelyn as he waited for the perfect opportunity to attack. Her voice, her face, and the way she had gazed at him as though she were bearing the weight of the entire universe. He knew he would stop at nothing to keep her safe, but he had no idea what was wrong. Carly, too. As well as his boys. They served as his family, keeping him rooted in a world that was always trying to shatter him. However, Jason was unaware, or unable to know, that the family he believed to be his own was going to grow significantly. While Port Charles bustled with its typical mayhem over the course of the following several days, Jocelyn's finding had a subtle impact on everyone it came into contact with. Carly found Jason and, following a heated encounter with Sunny, drew him aside. She didn't waste time making small talk. As they stood in the back area of Sunny's coffee shop, she murmured softly, "Jason, we need to talk. It concerns Vaughn." Jason's azure eyes searched hers as his brow furrowed. "Vaughn? From the docks, the kid? How about him?" Carly inhaled deeply, her heart racing. The words felt like lead in her throat, even though she had practiced this moment 100 times. "He is your son." Jason's face was unreadable as he froze. Carly briefly believed he hadn't heard her. Then, with a small, incredulous giggle, he shook his head. "That's not feasible, Carly." She took the medical document out of her handbag and gave it to him, saying, "It is. This was discovered by Josh. It was tested on her. Jason, it's true. Your son is Vaughn." With his jaw clenched and his thoughts racing, Jason gazed at the paper. He had compartmentalized his life for years, putting those he loved at arm's length when needed to protect them. A son? A kid he was unaware of? It was illogical. Nevertheless, something changed within him as he examined the document, the indisputable evidence of his DNA. Who is the mother? Finally, in a quiet, controlled voice, he asked. Carly gave a headshake. We're not sure yet. The documents don't specify. However, Jason, Vaughn has lived his entire life alone. He has no idea who he is. As the realization weighed heavily on Jason, his hands balled into fists. He reflected on Danny, Jake, and the sacrifices he had made to protect them. It felt like a failure he couldn't grasp, another son he hadn't known to protect. Jason stated, "I need to meet him," in a steady but somewhat intense voice. "I must see him." Carly nodded, realizing that there was no going back. "I'll arrange it. However, Jason, we must exercise caution. If this is discovered..." "I understand," he cut in, his eyes glowering with resolve. "Nobody else is able to know." "Not quite yet." Jocelyn entered Kelly's when Vaughn was cleaning tables, her heart racing. She had vowed to keep quiet to her mother, but it was too hard to bear to see Vaughn unaware of the truth. He was entitled to know. He was worthy of a family. She gestured for him to join her as she slid into a booth and said, "Hey." Sitting opposite her, Vaughn smiled, his dark hair falling into his eyes. "Look at yourself." Why the somber expression? After a moment of hesitation, Jocelyn leaned closer and spoke softly. "You need to know something, Vaughn. Regarding your family." His smile vanished, to be replaced by a suspicious interest. "My relatives?" "I don't have a family, Joss." She looked directly into his eyes and answered, "You do. And I believe it's time for you to meet them." The meticulously planned lives of everyone in Port Charles started to fall apart as the days stretched into weeks and the truth about Vaughn's origin became apparent. The weight of their common blood hung between them as Jason and his son stood in the shadow of a ship at the docks, meeting at a peaceful moment. There was a spark in Vaughn's eyes, one that Jason knew was his own, but he was cautious and uncertain. Knowing that the path ahead would be paved with secrets and peril, Carly and Jocelyn observed from the sidelines. Still in the dark, Sonny had a gut feeling that something wasn't right, his intuition sharpened by years of dealing with devotion and treachery. A figure from Jason's past was also lurking in the shadows, waiting for the ideal opportunity to emerge from the shadows and take their rightful place in this complex web. The identification of Vaughn was just the first step. Secrets were never kept hidden for long in Port Charles, and the consequences of this one would put love, loyalty, and family ties to the test in ways no one could have foreseen. Jocelyn tried to carry on as though nothing had changed, but every time she looked at Vaughn, the truth weighed heavier on her chest. She couldn't unsee the resemblance anymore, the sharp jawline, the piercing stare, the way he listened more than he spoke. Vaughn was Jason through and through, even if neither of them knew it yet. She found herself drawn to him, not in a romantic sense, but with a strange protectiveness, as if she was holding on to something fragile that could break with one wrong move. Her friends began noticing her distraction. Trina asked why she kept staring at Vaughn, but Joss brushed it off with excuses. She couldn't risk letting anyone else in on what she had discovered, not yet. She had learned the hard way that secrets spread quickly in Port Charles, and once they did, they took on lives of their own. Still, the pressure grew unbearable. One night, Joss found herself outside Jason's penthouse, pacing the hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wanted to knock, to spill everything right there, but when Jason opened the door, his eyes tired and distant, she froze. He asked if she was okay, and she forced a smile, mumbling something about school and needing advice. Jason, ever the protector, invited her in and listened as she rambled about trivial things, though her mind screamed with the words she couldn't say, "You have a son." She left that night more conflicted than ever, realizing that telling Jason wasn't just about dropping a truth bomb. It was about changing his entire life, altering the fabric of who he was, and bringing in a son who had lived years believing he didn't belong anywhere. Meanwhile, Vaughn continued his quiet search for answers. He opened up to Joss in fleeting moments, telling her about the nightmares that haunted him, dreams of motorcycles, gunfire, and a man's voice calling his name. He didn't know where they came from, but they felt too real to be random. Joss listened, her heart aching with the weight of what she knew. Every word Vaughn spoke made it clearer that the bond between him and Jason wasn't something she had imagined, it was written in their very DNA. Vaughn deserved to know the truth, and Joss hated herself for staying silent. She could barely sleep, the secret clawing at her every time she closed her eyes. The turning point came when Vaughn ended up at General Hospital after a scuffle at the docks. He had been in the wrong place at the wrong time and caught the attention of some of Sonny's rivals. Joss rushed to his side, frantic, and when the doctors ran tests, something happened that she hadn't anticipated. Jason, who had been at the hospital visiting Monica, crossed paths with Vaughn again, this time seeing him bruised and bloodied. For a fleeting moment, Jason's protective instincts kicked in, and he demanded to know what had happened. Joss saw it, the way Jason's tone changed, the way his jaw tightened, the way his hand hovered protectively near Vaughn's bedrail without him even realizing it. Jason didn't know why he cared so much, but Joss did. It was father and son standing face to face, connected by blood neither of them yet understood. That night, Joss made a decision. She couldn't keep this secret anymore, not when the truth was practically screaming in her face. She returned to the hospital's records room, pulling every string she could to confirm her suspicions. It was reckless, dangerous even, but Joss wasn't her mother's daughter for nothing. Carly had taught her how to dig, how to fight, how to stand her ground, and Joss was putting every bit of that knowledge to use. When she finally pieced together the adoption records, the sealed birth certificate, and the matching medical data, there was no denying it, Vaughn Morgan. The name had been hidden, altered, but the truth was undeniable. Jason had a son, and his name was Vaughn. The next day, Joss confronted Vaughn privately. She couldn't hold it in any longer. Her hands shook as she tried to explain, stumbling over words she had rehearsed 1,000 times in her head. Vaughn looked at her like she had lost her mind when she first blurted out the truth. He laughed bitterly, accusing her of trying to make him feel like he belonged somewhere he didn't. But when she showed him the paperwork, the records, the proof, his entire demeanor shifted. Vaughn's face went pale, his hands trembling as he stared at the evidence. He didn't want to believe it, couldn't believe it, but deep down he knew. The nightmares, the instincts, the pull toward Port Charles, it all made sense now. Jason Morgan wasn't just some stranger he had crossed paths with. He was his father. The shock was almost too much for Vaughn to process. He stormed out, leaving Joss terrified she had pushed him too far. She knew what it was like to have your world turned upside down in an instant, but this was different. Vaughn had lived his entire life believing in one identity, and now it had been ripped away. He disappeared for hours, wandering the streets of Port Charles, replaying every interaction he'd had with Jason in his mind. The man who had unknowingly saved him at the hospital, who had defended strangers with unshakable courage, who had stood by Sonny through every storm, that was his father. But what did that mean for him? Could he live up to the Morgan name, or was he destined to inherit the violence and danger that came with it? When Vaughn finally returned, it was to Jason's doorstep. Joss had told him the truth, but Jason didn't know yet, and Vaughn wasn't sure how to handle it. He stood outside the penthouse for what felt like an eternity, torn between walking away and knocking. When the door opened unexpectedly and Jason stood there, Vaughn froze. Jason's eyes narrowed with recognition, that same flicker of familiarity crossing his face again. Vaughn tried to speak but choked on the words, his throat tight with emotion. Jason, sensing something was wrong, asked if he was okay. And in that moment, Vaughn realized nothing would ever be the same again. Vaughn couldn't find his voice as Jason stood there waiting for an answer. His entire body trembled with the weight of what he had learned, and yet the words stuck in his throat like shards of glass. Jason, ever patient, simply studied him, that familiar stoic calm masking the flicker of concern in his eyes. Joss, who had rushed over after realizing Vaughn might confront Jason alone, arrived just in time to see them standing face to face. She held her breath, praying Vaughn would say something, anything, but he only shook his head and muttered that he shouldn't have come. He turned and walked away, leaving Jason frowning after him, confusion written all over his usually unreadable expression. Joss wanted to run after Vaughn, but she couldn't ignore the look Jason gave her, as though he knew she was holding something back. Guilt twisted in her stomach, and she wondered how much longer she could keep skating around the truth before it consumed her completely. Later that night, Vaughn showed up at Joss's dorm room, his eyes bloodshot, his hands unsteady. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, though it had only been hours since she had told him the truth. He demanded to know why she hadn't kept quiet. Why her? Why now? Joss tried to explain that she couldn't sit back and watch him suffer, that he deserved to know where he came from. Vaughn's voice cracked as he admitted he didn't know if he could handle it. He had built a life, however fractured, on the belief that his parents had chosen him, that his roots didn't matter. Now he was supposed to believe that his real father was Jason Morgan, a man who carried a reputation as both a hero and a killer depending on who you asked. Joss tried to reassure him that Jason was more than the stories, that he was loyal, selfless, and brave, but Vaughn wasn't ready to hear it. He stormed out again, leaving Joss terrified that telling him had been a mistake. Meanwhile, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He asked Carly if she had noticed anything unusual about Vaughn, but Carly brushed it off, insisting Jason was just being overprotective as usual. Still, Jason's instincts told him otherwise. He thought back to the hospital, to the fight at Charlie's, to the way Vaughn had carried himself. There was something in the kid's eyes, something hauntingly familiar. Jason had spent years estranged from his own son, Jake, and the thought of another child being out there had never crossed his mind. Yet the gnawing sense of déjà vu wouldn't leave him alone. He found himself replaying every moment with Vaughn, wondering why this stranger had carved out space in his mind so easily. Joss became more desperate as Vaughn started to spiral. He began drinking, picking fights, and pushing people away, unable to reconcile his past with the future staring him in the face. Joss tried to be his anchor, but she couldn't carry the weight of his pain alone. Finally, she decided enough was enough. She went to Sam, knowing that if anyone could help her, it was Jason's former partner in more ways than one. At first, Sam was wary. Joss was clearly hiding something big, and secrets in Port Charles always spelled disaster. But when Joss broke down and revealed the truth, Sam was floored. The pieces clicked into place for her just as they had for Joss. She agreed that Jason needed to know, no matter how messy the fallout might be. The moment of truth came sooner than expected. Vaughn had gotten into another fight at the docks, this time injured badly enough that he was rushed back to General Hospital. Jason was there when Vaughn was wheeled in, bloodied but conscious. Jason didn't understand why, but something primal ripped through him as he grabbed Vaughn's hand, promising he would be okay. It was the same protective instinct he had felt with Jake and Danny, and it terrified him. Sam arrived soon after, catching Jason off guard when she pulled him aside and told him he needed to hear what Joss had discovered. Jason was skeptical, even angry, that Joss had gone digging into Vaughn's life, but when Sam handed him the records Joss had pieced together, his world tilted on its axis. He stared at the birth certificate, the adoption records, the DNA evidence, his jaw clenching tighter with each passing second. It was irrefutable. Vaughn was his son. Jason was shaken to his core. He had lost so much time with Jake, missed out on raising Danny, and now here was another son, another piece of him that had been hidden away. Rage burned in his chest at the thought of who had kept this from him. Was it orchestrated by one of his enemies? Had someone deliberately stolen Vaughn from him? The questions consumed him, but one thing became clear: Vaughn was his, and he wouldn't lose him again. Still, Jason had no idea how to tell Vaughn, or if Vaughn would even accept him. The young man was already unraveling, and dropping this truth on him could push him over the edge. Joss watched as Jason sat by Vaughn's hospital bed, silent but steadfast, refusing to leave his side. Vaughn, groggy from painkillers, muttered incoherently, but Jason's hand never wavered from holding his. Joss felt a swell of relief and guilt at the same time. She had set this entire chain of events in motion, and while she knew it was the right thing to do, she couldn't ignore the fallout it had caused. She wondered if Jason would ever forgive her for keeping the secret so long, or if Vaughn would ever forgive her for shattering the life he thought he knew. But in her heart, she believed the truth was worth the pain. Because for the first time in his life, Vaughn wasn't alone. He had a father, and whether he wanted to admit it or not, Jason Morgan wasn't going anywhere.